and watch that against fern. Um, Once these come together, you'll get a new big leaf, and depending on the species, it might be a few months or it might be a few years, but eventually you'll have, another big plant like you'd recognize as a fern out in the woods. Since the scope's set up, I'm going to go ahead and show you the next plant on it and then go back to the PowerPoint. But this is Lygodium palmatum. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. And it has these big kind of ivy-like leaflets and these little ones. The big ones are sterile. They're just making energy for the plant. And then the fertile ones are these little tiny ones. So these are where the sporangia are being made. So they're kind of dividing it up between different parts of the plant. But I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint to show you why I'm talking about Hartford fern here in a minute. Okay. So that was our gametophyte from the life cycle. So everybody loves ferns, and this reached its peak in Victorian England. So in the late 1800s, a little bit in the US, more in England, we had pteridomania. So pterido, that was that feather word that we use for studying ferns. This was fern mania or fern fever. So this was a huge craze that swept England and to the US to a lesser extent. So ferns were really the in thing. So cultivating ferns, going out and gathering them, collecting them, all of these things were the mark of sophistication and um, and timeliness. There was a lot of things that came about, like Wardian cases were created, basically very fancy looking terraria to help bring things from the tropics up to England and keep them growing there. And there was a lot of fern art, like this painting of a fern gatherer. So as the painting shows, a lot of wild ferns were being gathered, and this spread to the US. And one of the most popular ferns in the US was Hartford fern, Lygodium palmatum. So this is showing those big sterile photosynthetic leaflets here on a plant. And this was considered to basically be the epitome of fern beauty in the US. So these were very sought after plants, and they don't reproduce super fast. So they quickly became quite rare and threatened. And they actually became the first plant protected by law in the US on account of its beauty. So it's a little fern distinction that we love to drag out all the time. But these Hartford ferns, they're still around today, but they're very cool. They have very long leaves with all these little leaflets on them. But they were our big American contribution to pteridomania. So there's some different flavors of ferns. We have a couple different types of big categories of ferns that we can think about. And I keep talking about spores and sporangia, and it has to do with those sporangia, how the spores get made. So we have some groups of ferns that are eusporangia. Oh, sorry, I meant to pass around the Hartford thing. I'll show you some examples of those in a minute, but these have comparatively real big sporangia. You can see them with the naked eye often, and they make lots of spores, hundreds and hundreds. And they split open kind of like a clamshell. They just break open like a clamshell, and they can dump or kind of shake the spores out into the air. So we do have some of those around here. They're not as many species in this group, but things like equisetum, the horsetails or the scouring rushes, those are in this group. These are kind of neat plants because they accumulate silica, similar to sand. So their stems feel pretty rough. So that scouring rush name comes from a traditional use of the plants to basically like a natural Brillo pad to clean things. We have a couple species around here. This very tall, straight one, Equisetum hymale, and then Equisetum arvense kind of grows like a weed. It spreads underground through the stems. So if you're trying to get rid of it, you have to be careful not to break up the ground it's growing in, or you'll just basically be transplanting it around your yard. I'll show a couple of those on the scope in a minute when I go back to it. But the other group of ferns, what most ferns are what we call the leptosporangiate ferns. And they have this crazy thing called the leptosporangium. And I know that's quite a big word, but it's really neat. We can just think of them as a catapult, because as we're going to see in a minute, they're little spore catapults. So these are way smaller. You really need a microscope of some kind to be able to see them. They don't make as many spores, but they do this catapult thing to launch the spores into the air. And what they do is they have this little kind of zipper on the sporangium. It's colored blue in this photograph from a scanning electron microscope. And what it does is that when it dries out, this blue part contracts backwards and rips the whole thing apart. And then when the pressure gets too great, it flings the spores forward. So it's really like a catapult. So there's kind of like a little diagram here. That zipper is in red and blue. It dries out. It pulls backward and rips the whole sporangium apart. And then when the pressure gets too great, there's actually little air bubbles that form, but it springs forward, and it springs forward fast and launches those spores out into the air. So later I'll show you a little video clip of a different fern thing that's a time lapse. This is real time. So these are big clusters of sporangia. So we're going to zoom in and see the individual sporangia in each of these black stripes or commas here. So this kind of caramel colored thing here, that's that zipper I was talking about. That's the part that rips it open. So that one there just launched a bunch of spores in the air. So this one's pulling back. This is real time. And the pressure gets too great and it flings them forward. So it's really too fast to see. When people want to videotape it and actually see the process, they put them in sugar water to slow them down, like make more resistance. But in the air, it just flings forward kind of faster than you can see. So those are all spores, the things that look like little stars in the night sky there. So the spores are tiny, but they get flung out there and they can catch a wind current and they can float off to some new habitat or new land. Then I'll just mention, a lot of times when people talk to me about ferns, they'll say that they saw the spores on the underside. Usually what they mean is that they saw this thing we call a sorus. So in that video we just watched, it was like a big comma or stripe. And a sorus is a big cluster, like a neighborhood of sporangia. So if you zoom in on the microscope, you can see a little cluster of these sporangia. And then you need a lot more magnification to be able to see a single spore. So when you flip it over and you see stuff on the bottom of the fern leaf, there is spores in there, but you're not really seeing the spores. You're seeing this little cluster, this little neighborhood of sporangia. So one trait that almost all ferns share is that they have what's called fiddleheads, or the technical term is circinate vernation. And it means that when their new leaves come out, they unfold like a spiral. So it's like a nautilus shell. So this leaf comes up and it's wrapped up inside itself like a little nautilus shell in that spiral. So when it comes out, it just kind of unrolls, so it unfurls. And this is just about all the leptosporangiate ferns. It's a really good field character if you're trying to tell if something's a fern, because there are a couple other groups of plants that do this, but most of them are either sundews, so tiny little plants covered with gooey red hairs that eat insects, or they're cycads, which are tropical. So if you're outside and the plant's not covered in slime and red hairs, and you see one of these fiddleheads, it's a fern. So it's a really nice character for being able to tell most of the ferns in our area. But that's a slower process. So this is a time lapse. You can see there's a little date clicker up here. This is March 26. Now we're on to day 2. And as they come up, they're in that tight little spiral pattern, and they're going to start unfurling. And depending on the size of them, they can spend quite a while unfurling. This is day 4, I think, already. This time lapse is very slow, so I think the rocking back and forth is maybe tracking the sun in the greenhouse. I'm not totally sure. This is March 31st, so it's been about 5 days so far, and we're still have a little bit of the fiddlehead. Day 6, still a little bit left to unfurl. So this is a lot slower than those sporangia, but it's a pretty neat character. So tree ferns are really common in New Zealand, and I'm not sure exactly why they got picked, but there's one in particular, the whiteback tree fern, Cyathea deobata, that's become their national symbol. So it's that one in particular that you see like on Air New Zealand planes or on the rugby team jerseys. They're really proud of it, which I definitely approve of. I've had students visit New Zealand and they bring me back little packets of silverback fern spore. They sell it in the grocery store, just like seed packets for tomatoes are sold here. So I'm not exactly sure how that particular one became it, but it's a pretty common species in New Zealand. So so almost all ferns have fiddleheads, but there is one that gets called fiddlehead fern, even though almost everything else has fiddleheads, and that's ostrich fern. So this is our main edible fern in the eastern US and most of North America. That said, it's pretty rare in Virginia. There's only a handful of sites for it across the state. So it does fairly well in cultivation, which is where you're going to see it around here. But when you start going north, like I grew up in northern Pennsylvania, and there'd be a big floodplain forest filled with acres and acres of ostrich fern. So once you start getting up into the northeast, you get a lot more of this fern, but they're edible. You can cut the fiddleheads off when they're about this size here in the photo. And usually they get kind of cooked like asparagus. I do have a cookbook that's put out by the American Fern Society that has fiddlehead ice cream and other treats that I haven't been brave enough to try. But you can cook them up. But if you want to do them around here, it's best to garden or to travel somewhere and pick them up. So there are a few other things that are eaten. Those ostrich ferns, those are our main ones in the US, especially the Northeast. But then there's other things that pop up around the world. When I was in Malaysia, I had vegetable fern, Diplasia mesculentum. And then bracken fern gets eaten in a lot of Eastern Asia. So bracken fern does grow around here, but it is fairly toxic and is thought to be carcinogenic. So there's a hypothesis that higher stomach cancer rates in some East Asian countries are correlated with bracken fern consumption. So you can go to like Oasis, and usually they'll have bracken fern noodles or things in stock, but I wouldn't really recommend cooking them up. And maybe I'll show a couple of these things on the scope, and then we'll go back to fern dinosaurs. And if I'm taking too long, just let me know, and I can skip some stuff or speed up. We're at the southern end of its range. It really likes cold. So you go up to like Pennsylvania, you start to get a lot of it. And then the big commercial industry is like Maine and New Brunswick. So it's just more of a northern species. So this is a close-up of the equisetum that we mentioned earlier, one of the eusporangiate things. So it has these real tough stems. They have silica in them. So they kind of feel sandy. And these are actually the leaves. They're very reduced. They're just this tiny little fringe of things. This is the fertile part of the plant, this little cone looking thing. All the little bumps in there, there's sporangia in there. So that's where those eusporangia are at. Turn that one around. In person, folks. This is a rattlesnake fern. This is one of our most common eusporangiate ferns in the area. And these are its little sporangia here, or sorry, big sporangia, eusporangia here. So you can kind of get a sense, each of these is a individual sporangium. So they're much easier to see. I know they still look tiny, but compared to the leptosporangia, they're huge. I forget.
It's like, I think of it, it's like the doctor of butterflies, it's a beautiful ring, so the doctor, that's not what it means.
Thin, fine, slight, delicate. And this is the ostrich fern. So there's a vegetative leaf on the specimen. And then it also has one of the fertile leaves. They make these really weird looking things that when they're full size, 3 or 4 feet tall, they look kind of like an ostrich plume. And the sporangia, we can't really see them in here. They're tucked away far inside there. Yep, so there's 2 leaves on the specimen that's going around now. So they're what's called dimorphic. They have 2 forms of leaves. So some of them are big and green. Their job is to make energy from the sun. And then some of them are just small and brown or black, and they just make spores. So they have kind of a division of labor. This plant does it kind of partially. This is interrupted fern. We're about to look at this one. So there's some fertile parts in the middle of the leaf. They interrupt the leaf. So there's green fertile or green photosynthetic parts above and below them. And then in between, we get these little kind of shriveled clusters of leaf matter. And these are where the spores are being made. But this plant has a long fossil history. So we're going to take a look at that. It could. Some of them are very general and some have very specific habitat requirements. So if you got it into the right spot, it could grow. And a lot of them do kind of like freshly exposed soil. It's slow though. So if you're trying to propagate your ferns, it's a lot better if you can get them to spread through the stem and split them up into clumps. Sometimes it can take years to go from spore to mature plant. These greenhouse ones, like the gametophytes I passed around, they're tropical and they grow super fast. But the stuff around here, it's a lot easier to do it by dividing plants usually. So another thing for people often mention about ferns is, oh, I know ferns are the dinosaur plants. They're like super ancient. And there's kind of 2 ways to think about this. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. So ferns go way back in the fossil record, all the way back to the mid-Devonian, almost 400 million years ago. So if the present day is up here at the pickup truck, they're all the way down here at the star. So the ferns, they go back to that ancient time, but pretty much everything that was around then is extinct now. About one of the youngest lineages that we have is that interrupted fern that I just showed. It's in the royal fern family, Osmundaceae, and those go back to the Permian, which is almost 300 million years. So still very old, but not quite as old as the rest of the original ferns. So that interrupted fern, people have found fossils that resemble it very, very closely to the point where they can't quite tell or classify the fossil as distinct from the living plant. So we don't know if it's actually the same species or if it's just kind of the way this group of plants likes to grow and to kind of a coincidence. But some people call it a living fossil. But this group goes back almost 300 million years. Most ferns, though, are a lot younger. Most of them are about the same age as the average flowering plant. So most of them came about in the Cenozoic after modern rainforests were after modern rainforests were around. So those lineages are basically no older than flowering plants. So if you want to know if ferns are dinosaurs, it kind of depends. If you are talking about the entire fern tree and you're thinking about their long lost ancestors, then yeah, they're dinosaurs. If you're talking about the ferns that you see on a hike around the woods today, then no, not really. They're not really any older.
I was gonna ask, so the tree ferns are the oldest?
Not quite. They're a little. Oh yeah. Yeah, so the names get confusing in there too. So there's things like seed ferns, which have fern-like leaves in the fossil record, but they make seeds. So they're actually a totally different group of plants. And then there's some things like equisetum, the one with the silica, the sand in its stems. Those used to be huge. That lineage, that group of plants used to make huge tree-sized species, but today they're all tiny. So it gets complicated. Sometimes there's things that get called fern in the fossil record that aren't, and then sometimes there's things that today they're small, but they used to be huge. For some of the lineages, yeah. It's kind of a mixed bag. It kind of depends on what you're talking about. The tree ferns themselves, like the group of tree ferns that's alive today, those are pretty old, but they're younger than these interrupted ferns or royal ferns. So another weird fern is one that could maybe feed the world and has changed our climate. This is an entire plant of mosquito fern, Azolla. Each of these little kind of rectangle looking things is the top of a leaf. So there's little branches going around here and some little roots that you can't really see too well. But this is an entire plant on my friend Carl's fingernail. So this is very tiny plant, but it's had a really big impact on people. It's an aquatic fern. It likes fresh water, and most of them are found in tropical areas. There's a few that get up a little colder, but mostly they like the tropics. So they're aquatic, they like fresh water, they're in the tropics. They also fix nitrogen. They have a cyanobacterium inside their leaves. There's a special cavity in their leaves that houses the cyanobacterium, and it fixes nitrogen for them. So it's kind of like a soybean, kind of the same partnership. So with all of those things, it's been used to fertilize rice paddies. So it gets grown in rice paddies. This is a video of Azolla being harvested
Azolla in a rice paddy with Lombok here.
in Indonesia.
But this is a barley culture, and they're using
Very
very
fast, yeah.
sustainable methods here. Because what the Azolla does, it prevents the weeds, ramput, yeah, from growing here, and then they grow the Azolla, which double in size every 5 days.
So doubles every
And
5 days, it says.
bucket here. And that
Whoops. Yeah. So it's been used to fertilize rice paddies. It's not as common now because of chemical fertilizers. But traditionally that was a really common way to fertilize rice paddies, and it was used as livestock feed. Chickens, cows, all kinds of stuff would eat this. It's being explored today as a possible human food source. Although I love ferns, but the pictures of the Azolla bread that I saw online did not make me particularly hungry. So I don't know, might be a ways to go on that one. But Azolla also changed the global climate. So a little over, whoops. Hang on a second. A little over 50 million years ago in the Eocene, global climate hit a peak, one of the hottest times in that period. And then it kind of fell off a cliff. It went down really dramatically. And it turns out that Azolla is a big reason why. It was so hot then that there were freshwater seas in the polar areas. And we found huge deposits, like tens of feet of fossil Azolla in these areas. So near as I can tell, Azolla would grow in such vast quantities on these polar seas and then sink to the bottom and get locked away in the sediments that they sequestered a ton of carbon and actually lowered the global climate. So could be a cool one for today, but that is geologic time we're talking about. So that might not be a feasible strategy for today, but yeah, it's in Virginia, but it's not very common. Azolla taxonomy is a train wreck. I just got an email about that. Yeah, I worked on it a while ago, so a colleague of mine sent me some results from a study he's doing, and yeah, he was basically like, "Do you have any guess what's going on here?" And it's like, "No, I don't." So, one of the big problems is that they're so tiny, so they all basically look the same, and then there's a lot of taxonomic issues with how you name a new species. There were a lot of kind of bad practices or accidents that happened along the way that complicated things, and they almost never go fertile. They just reproduce vegetatively, so it's really hard to get the sporangia that make it easier to tell them apart. And we have invasive ferns. So in the southeastern US, I showed that Hartford fern earlier, the one that was over collected because it was so beautiful. Its invasive cousin, Lygodium japonicum, is a huge pest in the southeast, especially this photo is down in Florida. It's a climbing fern, so you can see it's climbed up these tree trunks and is completely smothering this forest. So this fern can grow in just vast patches down there. It's native to East Asia. So it's not much of an issue around us, but a little further south, it's a very bad invasive. This is a close-up of one of the leaves. The little tassels on the end are the fertile parts where the spores are being made. And then there's kind of more normal or energy-making leaf tissue in the middle. There are some other invasive ferns too, like the cousin of that Azolla I just showed you is one of the big global invasives, but I kind of skipped over it. And then some ferns have made friends with animals. So we don't think about ferns for partnerships like mutualisms with animals as often. A lot of the ones that we think of for plant animal things, it's like it pollinates the flowers or it disperses the seeds or fruits. Ferns don't have flowers, seeds, or fruits. So all of those options are out. But there's actually a lot of ferns that have established relationships with ants. So this is Lechinopterus, the ant fern. This is a genus of epiphytic ferns from Southeast Asia. So epiphyte means they live on trees. So they get these big weird looking stems here. They look like big green puddles in this photo. This is a potted one in a greenhouse. And then there's all kinds of stuff going on inside those weird green puddles. There's these big chambers and tunnels and things, and those are formed by the plant. And they're colonized by ants. So the ants come in and live inside them, and then what the plant gets is protection. So when I was on a collecting trip to Malaysia and we collected a Lechinopterus, it was basically like drawing straws to see who had to do this, because when you started cutting it apart, the ants would swarm out and start biting you. So it's a really good defense mechanism for the plant. And then the ants get a nice little home to live in. So that's Southeast Asia. Closer to home, we have bracken fern, which has relationships with ants as well. So when bracken fern is sending up new leaves, when those fiddleheads are getting big and getting expanded, there'll be little spots on the leaves. Usually they're where there's little splits in the leaf stalk, like where a leaflet branches off, that have little nectaries that produce little bits of sugar water. And these will be visited by ants. So this is a photo I took pretty close to Dismal Falls a few years ago. I'm not a great macro photographer, but there's a little ant here, or a couple ants, at this nectary. So they visit the nectaries. I tried harassing them. I was like tapping the stem and trying to get them to come attack me. And they didn't really do anything. So they didn't seem to be tending the plant. So this has been looked at for a long time. Charles Darwin's son, Francis Darwin, actually looked at this. And what he found was that sometimes the ants defend bracken fern and sometimes they don't. So bracken fern is found around the world. So it might be that maybe this relationship is kind of further along in some parts of the world than others. We're not really totally sure what's going on. But here's a younger bracken fern fiddlehead, and you can see an ant there visiting the nectary. So it's collecting some sugar water. So for us, they don't seem to defend the ants, but defend the plants, but the ants do visit the plants at least around us. And then I think this is the last one. So there's this is more of taxonomic fun, I guess, but there are desert ferns. There are ferns that are adapted to live in very dry conditions. And one of them was named after Lady Gaga a few years ago. This was by a research team at Duke. I used to work in that lab. And then I'm getting old, so that was a while ago. That was before Lady Gaga existed, basically. But since I left, they became big Lady Gaga fans, and they named this genus of ferns after her. So the scientific name for the genus is Gaga. And this is a group of desert ferns, and they had all this evidence that they presented. They got a lot of press coverage for this.
We have that.
Not around here, but in the Southwest, yeah. So this is a gametophyte. We passed around those gametophytes earlier. This is a very heart-shaped one. This is an outfit Lady Gaga wore to, I don't know, a concert or the Grammys or something that my old mentor was convinced looked like a gametophyte. So she named it after Gaga. So we have one species that we represented in the herbarium. They're mostly from the Southwest, so Texas. Yep. So I'll show that in the scope in a minute, but then pass it around. They're mostly in Mexico and Central America, and then a little bit up in like Texas. No, it was in a different genus before, and they split it out. Some of the species were new, like they found some new species in it. They named one of them. They gave the species name Germinata, which is after her actual last name, which I don't remember. It must be Germota or Germinata or something. I don't remember the exact name, but there was another Lady Gaga connection in there too with one of the new species. But yeah, so we have all kinds of desert ferns. People think of ferns as liking these real dry, wet, moist, shady areas. You go down to Arizona to the Sonoran Desert, even go to the right microhabitat around here, and you can find ferns that are flourishing in brutal sun-baked hot conditions. A lot of these things will be really furry or fuzzy, like lots of hairs or scales to insulate them. A lot of them do weird reproductive things to get around the lack of water. But there's another strategy too, for surviving kind of dry conditions, and that's being a resurrection plant. So this one actually is around here. It's kind of scarce in the mountains. It's more common out near the coast. A student of mine was on spring break down in South Carolina near the coast and sent me some pictures last week of some tree branches just covered in luxurious colonies of resurrection fern. And this is the genus Pleopeltis. So they have real scaly undersides. So the little brown dots on here are scales. The big brown dots are those little sporangia neighborhoods, the sori. And these little scales, the little dots that are all over the bottom of the leaf, their job is to soak up water. So when this plant dries out, it curls over and gets completely crispy. You would swear it's dead. But then if you give it water, by the next morning or next day, it'll be back to looking vibrant and lush like this. I went collecting with my dad in Arizona back when I was, or Arkansas back when I was in college, and we grabbed one of these and I told him about it and demonstrated it. So we kept it on the dash of the pickup and named it Elvis. It was our little trip mascot that week. But this is a little time lapse of the process. So these are completely dried out fronds. If you ran across them in the woods, you'd probably think they were dead. And this is a time lapse. So this is over 2.5 hours of adding water. And you can see they spring back to life really quickly. Oh, cool. Yeah, I've seen there's one spot in Blacksburg where I've run across them. But they do like warmer spots a little bit more. Yeah, I get these videos off of YouTube for class, and sometimes my students really crack up with the musical choices. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when they curl up, it's the underside of the underside of the leaves that they're showing. And then so that's the scaly side.
The fern is an
So those are the resurrection ferns. I'll go through these last couple slides and then I'll show the Lady Gaga fern on the scope and pass it around. But if you're interested in other things, The Natural History of Ferns is a great book by an old friend of mine, Robin Moran. He talks about all kinds of different scientific and cultural things, and it's not a textbook. It's a popular science book, so it's really fun reading. And the American Fern Society, if you're interested in things like the spore exchange, you can join that and try some fern cultivation. I'm also happy to do more fern lessons, like if you want an ID workshop or something. I didn't get into a lot of the terminology with ferns because there's a lot of it. So I've done like a half-day workshop before for master naturalists for fern ID. So I'm happy to do something like that if there's interest. I'll also mention that we welcome volunteers in the collection. So if you want to come help us prepare, handle some of the specimens, or help us with some of our outreach events. I stole this slide from a master naturalist presentation I gave. So if you're in master naturalist, it'll fulfill your service requirements. And you can see our website, and we try to post pictures of things like the skunk cabbage last week and stuff online. And this is one of our local ferns from that desert fern group. This is what our logo is based on. This is over at Claytor Lake. This was discovered by Stan Bentley and Tom Weebolt here back in the early 80s. So it's the only population in Virginia. Very isolated occurrence of this species. And it's one of these desert ferns from that lineage. So it's got kind of furry leaves and very heat resistant compared to what you think of for a normal fern. But I'll switch over and show that Gaga fern. The table over there has stickers with that fern design on it, big ones and little ones. And then the square things are temporary tattoos. And there's business cards too, if you want to grab my contact info. But I'm happy to take any questions that you have while I switch over to the scope.
How far off of the water are going to fish is that when so did we boat and not be spread on the rocks?
It's almost down to the water.
Oh, so you can see it from the boat. Are they still there?
We have a question in the chat. The question is, can you speak about sensitive fern? It puts up stalks that fall through what look like brown berries.
Yep. So yeah, this is the Gaga fern. Hard to show the whole thing here. Maybe I can stop the share. So Gaga fern. So sensitive fern. It's kind of like the ostrich fern that we looked at earlier. It makes two different kinds of leaves. So it does that same division of labor. It has the wide kind of bright green leaves. Their job is to photosynthesize to make energy. And then it also makes those ones that look like they have the berries on them. So those leaves are the reproductive ones. So those are just making spores. So they're real small and dark colored because they don't have a lot of chlorophyll. They're not wasting time making energy from the sun. Their job is just to grow, make those sporangia, release the spores. And the sporangia are clustered into these little kind of bead or berry looking things. So those little kind of brownish leaves that come up and have the little beads or berries for the sensitive fern, those are the fertile leaves. They're making the spores for the plant.
We had a interesting thing happen with the fern at Lady Lake because the cliff there where it grows is a favorite spot for kids to go out there and jump off into the lake. And it was becoming quite a hangout, which I was getting very concerned about. So the park manager called me up one time and I found out that he was an ex-Marine with a background in what is it called? Detonation kinds of things. And he wanted to blow up the cliff so they could get rid of the problem. And somebody told him that, maybe you should check with somebody about this fern that's out there. So they called me up and fortunately I was able to talk him out of doing that. And so it was a close call. I mean, it was fortunately that they called rather than just going ahead and doing it, which
I
sometimes,
can't imagine they don't have that.
anyway.
Scary. Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah. He's grown out now? No. Yeah, it probably has just a real tight rootstock.
They grow it in the nursery and you sell it, it's common one sold. But I don't know.
You guys aren't talking to the people.
These things have
Yeah.
to be,
You should close the meeting if we're.
they
gonna
have to
talk.
be
Yeah.
30 years old. These were 30 years old. Still have to be.
For those on Zoom, and for the few items we have here, my understanding is one of the issues that we're going to discuss tonight, we don't have enough members here to vote on it. So that simplifies tonight's meeting. Wanted to mention to everyone that the bare root sale is on. And I believe plants are available to start already, right?
Yeah, there's still, you have to, yeah, order them with the, yes.
Yes, so contact Beth Umberger to order the plants. Reminder that there won't be a summer sale in June at Seeds as we've had in the past. Just want to mention that. And what's very interesting is that earlier, the decision was made for Forest Appreciation Day to talk to people about the role of ferns in the forest, and which goes, yes, ferns in general. And so that fits very well with tonight's excellent presentation. And as far as I know, I'm looking at the chat as well. I don't see any other items to bring up, which this would end our meeting.
You don't have to, but our meeting has changed for April. We'll send out a-
Yes, and the speaker for next April is going to be an extension agent from Pulaski, correct? From Bland County, and so that's a change in the speaker, but information will be sent out to everyone in the email. And if anybody has anything to bring up, that's I'm watching the chat. So anybody on Zoom? So thanks everyone for joining in. This is really an excellent evening. Thank you.
You guys want to have